Welcome to Indus Special. I am Ejaz Haider. We're going to kick off with Kashmir once again, the occupied territory that was annexed by India on August 5th. We have been following the story as it is unfolding. The international media is obviously also cognizant of what's been happening there. But before that, let me just tell you that finally, India has officially accepted that they shot down their own helicopter during a battle with Pakistan on the morning of 27th February. Now, let me say that even at the time this happened, those who actually keep an eye on these things had said that the helicopter was shot down in friendly fire. But obviously, the IAF was doing an inquiry. And then, interestingly, Colonel Ajay Shukla, who was a former cavalry officer of the Indian Army and now writes analyses, wrote in one of his articles saying that the IAF had been asked by the government. And remember, this is the time when India is in the run-up to its elections. So Colonel Shukla wrote that the IAF High Command has been told by the government not to release the findings of the inquiry because that could impact the elections. Of course, the IAF immediately wrote back saying, no, there's no such thing, and this is not correct. But Colonel Shukla put the IAF response below his article and then responded to that response saying that he stands by his story. Now, that is officially the truth that the Indian Air Defense unit there panicked and shot down its own helicopter. But let's go to Kashmir. It's the 61st day of communications blackout. The economy is, the state's economy is tanking. People are in dire straits. I have with me Ms. Hina Rabbani, the former foreign minister of Pakistan. But before I go to her, let me just play this clip for you where people are talking about what the situation is.
मंडी में बिल्कुल भी माल नहीं है, जितना भी माल है ये सब अब सड़ रहा है धीरे धीरे।
हम डब्बे को लगा रहे थे 18 रुपए किराया, उस डब्बे को इस टाइम अभी 50 रुपए किराया लगाना पड़ रहा है।
मैं यहाँ पे 1 घंटे से वेट कर रहा हूँ, अभी तक मुझे यहाँ पे अभी कॉल का कोई चांस नहीं हुआ है।
कहाँ फोन करना है?
अपनी माँ को फोन करना है यूट्यूब।
This is just a minor reflection of what's happening in the occupied and now annexed territory. Pakistan obviously has been reaching out to other state powers, world leaders. The Prime Minister also delivered a speech at the United Nations General Assembly. But let me just ask Ms. Khar, because that was her portfolio, what exactly is it that we've done so far and what more is required?
Thank you, Ejaz. I think clearly, first of all, just a brief comment on what you were saying like minutes before, because we have to accept and understand that right now what is happening at a very large scale, visible to the naked eye, whether it be a diplomatic eye or a layman's eye, is the erosion of the credibility of the state of India. Okay, and this is not only reflective in the way they've handled this entire occupied Kashmir issue, but also in the incident that you mentioned before of 27th February. How a plethora of lies was revealed by Indian state institution spokespersons, and then they literally had to go back on pretty much every statement and every version of events as they had laid out. Now, what that has happened is that I think few understand as to how very grave consequences something like that has. Because if you see the tilt of Indian international media on Indian occurrences and Indian state narrative, now the international media is all turning around and doing their own reporting, not based on what the Indian media, even the state is saying, but based on their ground reports. And the ground reports in Kashmir tell a very different story than the one that was laid out by the Indian media and the Indian state. So in trying to support, the Indian media is actually corroding the Indian state's credibility. So, this is this level of patriotism and these discussions we have in Pakistan also many times. But all in all, I think the last few months and the last few years of Modi government has been a deep erosion of Indian state's credibility.
Now that you mention this, let me ask you something. Back in 1977, when Mrs. Gandhi imposed emergency, people kowtowed, but there was no support for that measure. Whatever kind of dictatorial rule that she had in mind or the way she ruled India for 2 years, there was no popular support. But it seems to me that this current Hindutva fascism and also the way the media is being controlled by the BJP government actually seems to have popular support. And I think that's a very dangerous trend.
Absolutely. And I think that confirms the belief that you can sell fear far more effectively than you can sell a vision. Okay, so what Prime Minister Modi has been able to do, like many of his peers around the world, including President Trump perhaps, Prime Minister Johnson, that people are able to otherize everyone else, okay, whether it's, you otherize them in terms of criminality, you otherize them in terms of sex, you otherize them in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion, and then scare the living daylight out of the poor people from the others, and in that you can sell and literally the murder and also the something which might be very harmful for the country and the state. Now, we all know many people, credible Indian journalists. Now, when you look at their writing, their reporting, you're appalled as to where their moral compass is. And this, you're very rightly pointing out, there's absolutely no resistance to this majoritarianism and this absolute state taking over basic human rights, going against its constitution at every level. And I have always maintained from the first day, from 27th of February, and especially when 6th of August happened, and prior to that, how the Indian state was telling, anti-Pakistan, legitimizing its behavior by saying, Pakistan is about to attack, launch an attack, this, that, the other, that this is a rogue India. Okay, when a country as the size of India, the scale of India, and the presence that it has in the region and in the world becomes rogue, it's a very, very, very dangerous trend. And I am glad to report, and I think as we're all watching, the world, if not the state, so the state spokespersons, I think we still have a lot of work to do to be able to generate or get some decent statements and reality check out of them, barring Turkey, perhaps a little bit of Malaysia, a little bit of Iran.
It's actually got to a point where New York Times, and when you were the foreign minister, we all monitored the international media, and there was a clear bias in favor of India. But this time, the New York Times leader yesterday actually said that the UN will have to intervene. But let me ask you something else also, because you also know finance. You were at one time advising the government on finance. The Indian economy, a lot is said about the Pakistani economy and how, structurally inefficient our economy is, and et cetera, et cetera. But recently, lots of independent Indian economists have been talking about how the Indian economy is stagnating and actually in certain sectors is tanking. Now, here's the thing. Given this Hindutva agenda, if 6 months down the line, if there is no focus on the economy, you suddenly have already this the highest unemployment in 45 years, do you think that this fascist regime is going to actually turn this majoritarianism and unleash it on the minorities on the pretext saying that, the jobs are being usurped by the minorities, et cetera, and also perhaps invoke the bogey of Pakistan and try, because, the situation 6 months down the line, if the economy doesn't really start looking up, is going to be pretty bad for India?
Absolutely. I think you hit it on the spot, because that's exactly what's going to happen. What happens is that in regimes like this, which are fascist in nature, are selling fear and are coalescing people around a negative theme and against hatred, antagonism, rather than a positive one, a vision for India, a vision to move forward. When they are cornered, and cornered they are, okay, because all of the fruits that Prime Minister Modi, and fruit of his credibility also, fruit of his being wined and dined by the biggest leaders around the world. We saw how Trump sat next to him as he went on in Hindi, speaking to his own people, and we saw how David Cameron prior to that, many years back, did exactly the same. Not many leaders will get this type of treatment. Now, is it just Prime Minister Modi getting this treatment because of his own credentials? I will argue no, that's not the case. Prime Minister Modi is getting this treatment because of the fruits of all the leaders that preceded him in making India, at least on the surface, a liberal democracy, democratic model, genuinely or generally secular in nature, despite the excesses in Kashmir at that time also. So Prime Minister Modi is living off the reputation of Manmohan Singh, of Vajpayee, of the people prior to that, and of course, Gandhi, Nehru, etc. Now, when Prime Minister Modi's own economic agenda has failed miserably, demonetization has led to a major catastrophic reality for the middle class and the lower middle class. And now, as you pointed out, not only is it stagnating and not going at the pace that it used to go, their economy, but actually some sectors are seriously contracting. And this will now, when they're pushed to the corner, they will create more animosity, more hate, and more blame the others. We've seen this play in a country and areas like Europe, far more advanced, democratically, education-wise, in the people's outlook, in people's commitment to democracy. And we saw what the immigrant population did to no other than the bastion of democracy in the world, the UK.
Absolutely.
Please expect nothing better of the world. I think we're going into this trend where fascism is the name of the day. Fascist regimes are supporting each other.
But here we're talking about 1.3 billion people with multiple languages, ethnicities, and lots of other fault lines. Since you talked about Modi's, he's kind of riding the gains of India over the last 4 decades. He wrote an article in the New York Times, an op-ed, praising Gandhi. That was like getting Nathuram Godse to write an op-ed in praise of Gandhi. But thank you so much. That was Ms. Hina Rabbani, Khar, former Minister of Pakistan, speaking with us. Let me quickly hop over to Dr. Muhammad Ashraf Bhat, a Kashmiri based in Saudi Arabia. Dr. Bhat, thank you for being on the program. You watched the clip also. Give us a sense of India's policy in Kashmir, because clearly the moment this oppression is lifted, like, one soldier for now, nearly 4 or 5 Kashmiris, once that is gone, if at all, there's going to be immediate protests. What is your sense of where things will go from there?
Okay, since thank you for having me in the show. So the clip was about the economy. It's the time of the fruit industry. This is the time of Kashmiris get the fruits, and this is the biggest industry. It's 46,000 crore industry, and it's total in Shabi. You have a business office report from the Kashmir Chambers, 5,000 crore business lost in 2 months. We have lost 46,000 jobs for Kashmiris because of the internet blockade. And you have tourism industry, which was the peak season of the tourism, and it's also in a Shabi. We have 13,000 people have been arrested, and they have been jailed outside the Kashmir. We don't know where they are. And there are people who have been pellet victims, including 9-year-old kids. You imagine. And then we have pellet victims, and they cannot go to hospital because the security forces are, picking them up from the hospital. This is a human cause, and you have 45% of the Kashmiri youth have mental problems, mental issues because of the stress. And from here, it's not going to stop here. As you rightly said, this time they cannot blame to Pakistan. They cannot blame to Hurriyat. No, the project is not stopping here. Project will go up. In the last week, the government of India made a claim that there are 50,000 temples in Kashmir, which Kashmiri Pandits refuted the claim that there are not 50,000. So, and they said there are 21,400 hectares of land which is under army, and the state governments from other states are making claims we will make hotels, and some of the chief ministers, they are saying we will marry Kashmiri girls. So this is one cost of it, and as you rightly said, it's the government, it is the media, it is even the Supreme Court of India is not able to even listen to
Dr. Bhat, I'm happy you talked about the Indian Supreme Court, because what they've done is, and I think that's really shameful, when the petitions on the revocation of Article 370, the reorganization is going to come into force on 31st October. They have already given the government 4 weeks to reply back, which essentially means that when the government comes back in November, they will raise this technical point that these petitions are now infructuous because the Reorganization Act has already been enforced, and the Supreme Court of India has passed no order with reference to that enforcement.
Okay, the problem with them is yesterday, a day before yesterday, when the people approached it, there are a lot of petitions against the Article 370. And the Supreme Court is saying they don't have time for Kashmir. They are busy with the Babri Masjid issue. Number one. Number two, they said the reports of arresting 144 kids, they said it's a media report, we are not going to believe it. So when the Supreme Court is against you, when the government is against you, when the media, which is embedded media, which is against entire Kashmir, and the narrative of the media is fictitious, and the whole narrative of 370, it was started with lies. It is sustained on lies, and it will sustain next whatever time. It will sustain on lies.
Thank you. That was Dr. Muhammad Ashraf speaking with us on what's happening in Kashmir, and also the role that the Indian Supreme Court, generally considered to be a strong independent institution, is playing. We're going to take a short break and return to discuss the Afghan situation, including talks between the Taliban and the Americans. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We now move on to Afghanistan. As we noted yesterday, the Taliban delegation, the Taliban Political Commission delegation was in Pakistan, and not coincidentally, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad was also there. He was there, in fact, before the TPC arrived and had his meetings with Pakistani officials. Also, there is the issue of the presidential elections in Afghanistan, and the rival candidates have respectively declared victories for each other, prompting the Election Commission to say they're the only institution that can finally decide a victor, and therefore there is no victor right now. To discuss the talks between the Taliban and the United States, and also the Afghan mission in general, we have with us Mr. Bharath Gopalaswamy, who is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Mr. Gopalaswamy, thank you so much. It seems to me that the Trump-Imran Khan meeting on the sidelines of the UNGA, where they talked about Afghanistan, is something where President Trump perhaps asked Pakistan to facilitate this more overtly. And this Taliban Political Commission delegation visit to Islamabad was part of that. Is that your sense also?
Yes, I think to a large extent, I think there must have been some kind of request made by President Trump, or because as we all know and we all understand, that the talks from the US-led initiative is not going anywhere, and it's like reached a stalemate. Perhaps what President Trump could have subtly told Imran Khan is, see what the temperature is, see where these things are. Can you do a bit of homework and see what the mood is and what we're essentially looking at. So because at the end of the day, these talks need to go forward. These talks need to happen at some level and happen at some place, if not in Doha or elsewhere. And I think Islamabad is not a bad place for these talks to begin from.
Okay, so here's the thing. As we know, the entire thing was kick-started by President Trump himself, and he got Zalmay Khalilzad to point person. Both of them invested quite a lot in this, and we also know that they were going to sign off, except that, that attack which also killed one of the American soldiers, and that's when President Trump said that he is walking back, and he said the talks are dead. However, it seems that the talks are not dead, and there is still an appetite on both sides. Our sources tell us that there's certainly an appetite on the Taliban side to keep this, to move this forward. And it seems to me that the U.S. administration also feels the same way. So what is your sense as an observer and as an analyst of where the problem is and how that could be smoothed?
I think you asked not $1 million, but a $10 million or $100 million question about where the problem is. I think if we identified that, we all will not be in this place where we are currently. I think the American administration, as it stands, I'm sure you've been following what's happening in the domestic political debate out here.
Yes, indeed.
It is totally distracted, and I think that's the foremost priority out here. Is President Trump, whether the impeachment, I think that's what occupies the central headline. Afghanistan is nowhere in any of these problems. So, you have a national security establishment, which has seen so many officials in the last so many years. Nobody really knows who is in charge at times. Leave that aside. When we come to the Taliban or the Afghan issue, I think it was not, I would correct you a little bit here, if I may, that it's not that American soldier that dying, that probably served as a catalyst, but it's this continuous pattern of violence in Afghanistan. At the same time,
I agree with you. I agree with you, except that I refer to that because President Trump referred to that. But I agree with you. But it's interesting that you refer to what's happening within the U.S. Now, in the event, because when this entire thing began, it was about President Trump saying, well, I'm going to go into the election mode with something solid on the table with reference to Afghanistan. But now that he's caught in the vortex of this whole sort of impeachment thing, and this is purely theoretical, this might not happen. We saw this. It did not happen with Clinton either. But if this does happen, how do you think would the next person act according to how the blob essentially looks at Afghanistan, or will this process be kept forward as the administration is trying to do right now? I know I'm asking you a speculative question, but I would still like to get your view on this.
No, I think the speculative question is a great question to just frame this and lay this into context. The context here is essentially anybody, whether it's America's friends or adversaries. It's confusing. All the time there were many countries complaining to saying we don't know who to talk to on the other side. Mm-hmm. And that is the problem in the American establishment today. I think whether it's friends or adversaries, they do not know what they do. They cannot have a handle on the sense of the American situation. So there are multiple signals, multiple voices, and multiple messages coming from, even if Zalmay Khalilzad says something, there is a tweet coming out the next day that contradicts entirely there is a possibility that there is a tweet coming out from President Trump itself that whatever Zalmay Khalilzad has been agreed is completely...
Or possibly from Secretary Pompeo. I mean, last time that entire thing about the draft, Pompeo wasn't particularly interested in that.
That's correct. So I think it's friends or adversaries or allies. It leaves the other end of the Taliban or Pakistan or Afghanistan confused about who are we talking to, what are we talking to, and whatever we have agreed stands water until the next tweet or until 6 a.m. next day. So I think there is a very big problem. And as you mentioned, the talks, they're going. What I sense from the talks is we don't have, from the American, we meaning the American, from our sense, there is no continuity or there is no stability or there is no certainty. So it is glad that somebody is engaging the Taliban, and there is some form of communication, whether it's right, wrong, political. There might be variances on the political perceptions about these talks, but there is somebody talking to somebody out there.
Absolutely.
There is somebody engaging.
But give me a sense, finally, before I wrap up the segment, Mr. Gopalaswamy. You've been looking at inside the Beltway for a long. We've always known, and this is kind of inevitable in any system, that there are multiple shops, and sometimes they are operating at cross purposes also. But do you think this time with the Trump administration that this kind of lack of coordination is even more pronounced?
Do I have to? I would be stating the obvious. I think this is
okay.
Unprecedented. This is unprecedented.
So this is unprecedented, and you think this is something which then sort of impacts the performance of the various institutions in relation to, for instance, they're not really knowing what kind of tweet will emerge from President Trump early morning that could just put paid to anything that had happened yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, this leadership style is, of course, unique. This is something that all of us are getting used to. So if you read the Washington Post stories today about what's going on in the Ukraine and how the embassies have been managed.
Yeah.
So this is something very unprecedented and unique. And, I've never worked inside the establishment. So from an outside perspective, this is, wow. I could just say, wow. These are sometimes the way things work. And that's the fact is that is a reality today, and we have to grapple and adjust to that reality.
Absolutely. We have to grapple with this reality and adjust. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Bharath Gopalaswamy speaking with us on the Afghanistan situation and talks between Taliban and the US. We're going to take a short break and return to discuss the story which said that French President Emmanuel Macron tried to set up a meeting between President Rouhani and President Trump. But what happened? That's what we're going to discuss after this break. Welcome back to Indus Special. As I said earlier, we're going to move to what President Emmanuel Macron was trying to stitch together. A meeting between President Rouhani of Iran and President Donald Trump of the United States. Politico actually came up with a story. They had the documents. And let me just read something out to you from there. And according to this, the French officials said that Donald Trump and Hassan Rouhani agreed on a 4-point document brokered by Emmanuel Macron in New York last week as a basis for a meeting and relaunching negotiations between the US and Iran. But it did not happen because while the presidents agreed on the document, President Rouhani predictably insisted that Trump first declare he would lift US sanctions. A phone call that Macron tried to set up between the two leaders as an alternative to the meeting did not take place because Rouhani declined to participate. So where do things stand? And for that, we have with us Ms. Mohadesh Tayourikhah. She is an Iranian analyst and joins us from Zurich, and Professor Herbert Reginbogin, who's a professor of international relations at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Thank you to both the guests. Let me begin with Ms. Tayourikhah. What is your sense, Ms., of this attempt by the French president? And he's been trying to get the two sides together for some time now.
I think it would, if Iranian president agreed to meet with Donald Trump with mediation of French president, I think French president would think that it would be very good for his reputation, and it would be very good for Donald Trump for his election campaign. But this is only good for Washington. It's not good for Iran, because of Iranian people and Iranian government look for commitment. And commitment is very important. And after unilateral withdrawal of JCPOA, which is the nuclear deal, from when U.S. withdraw from JCPOA, Iranian people and Iranian government lost their trust. And now they are looking for, they are waiting for United States to step forward. We are looking for that commitment. We are looking.
Which is why President Rouhani was so insistent that the sort of precondition for this meeting would be that President Trump declare that he's lifting the sanctions. Well, in any case, now President Trump himself is writhing under the weight of possible impeachment. But stay with me, Ms. Tayourikhah. Let me hop over to Professor Reginbogin here. Professor Reginbogin, this document that we're talking about, which it says that Tehran would agree that, and I'm quoting from it, Iran will never acquire a nuclear weapon, and will, again, quote, fully comply with its nuclear obligations and commitments, and will accept a negotiation on a long-term framework for its nuclear activities. It would also refrain from any aggression and will seek genuine peace and respect in the region through negotiation. This seems like this particular document was drafted in the White House, because this is exactly the kind of language that the Trump administration has been using with reference to Iran.
Yes, that's a text that would be acceptable, and I'm certain that was also acceptable to President Rouhani. So it's the language that was agreed upon. I think the issue here is, why wasn't the precondition by President Rouhani included at the time this agreement was negotiated? I think that's the important factor here.
No, but here's the thing, Professor Reginbogin. Let's try and game it another way. Now, if you're President Rouhani, and you also under pressure from the hardliners within the political configuration in Iran, and you know that that's a fact, you also know that you went into JCPOA against lots of internal tensions, and the United States unilaterally walked back from that and imposed primary and secondary sanctions on Iran. Now, if you want to go back to some kind of negotiation, what is it that you would want to sell to the people unless President Trump indicates as a precondition that this particular step will allow him to lift sanctions from Iran? I mean, that's the least the United States will have to do in order for President Rouhani to sell it back home.
I agree. But if you're negotiating an agreement and you have preconditions, which this becomes, this was a precondition, and I'm reading it as much as you are citing it, that it was not included in the agreement. You can say, okay, who begins this initiation? But that has to be a part of that agreement. You don't settle an agreement and then say, I have a precondition. Naturally, the domestic issues it described are equally important for any other leader who it has to respectfully be discussing this with other groups in his country.
Okay, I get your point. Let me. So your basic point is that if President Rouhani wanted this as part of the document, there should have been some mention of it at the preparatory stage, where something along these lines should have been part of the document, rather than him agreeing to the document in the first phase and then balking at meeting with President Trump and asking for a precondition. Is that what the essence of your argument?
The essence of the argument is right, but even the precondition wouldn't have to be in the agreement. It could be negotiated as a procedure.
Okay, great. Let me hop back to Ms. Tayourikhah. So here's the thing. Apparently, President Rouhani agreed to what was in the document. There was no mention in the document of President Trump announcing the lifting of the sanctions. But at the last minute, President Rouhani, obviously, I'm sure he was talking back home, talking to his aides and analysts and whatever the system is, and they probably told him that no, if you go into this meeting without getting anything out of it in terms of lifting of sanctions, some kind of announcement by President Trump, that this will go badly at home. Is this correct?
I don't think so. It was that way, because some days before President Rouhani traveled to New York, Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, in his speech said that we have no negotiation with United States unless they accept JCPOA again. I mean, unless they accept nuclear deal again, then we can negotiate. So when president has this thing in his mind, I'm sure when he was talking to French president, I'm sure that there were some talks about this, and maybe it's not on the document, but this is one of the expectations.
Okay,
that Iran
I get your
has.
point. I get your point. Let me recap this. So there are two centers of power. There's the political center of power where President Rouhani is the chief executive, but then there's also the supreme spiritual leader, which is another center of power. And it seems to me that the way you have formulated this or analyzed this, it seems to me that President Rouhani at the last minute had to sort of, hold back because he thought that this will not go down well with the other spiritual center of power. Is that sense correct?
No, because I think both of them, both centers of power, the president and supreme leader, are agreeing on this matter that unilateral withdrawal of U.S. from JCPOA was not in favor of Iranian people, and sanctions and situation, economical situation in Iran after U.S. withdrawal from JCPOA is not good for Iranian people. So,
but precisely, I agree with you. I agree with you. But precisely for that reason, rhetoric aside, the fact is that Iran really wants to get into some kind of arrangement with the United States in order for the U.S. to lift some of the sanctions, if not all of the sanctions, because the Iranian economy is hurting.
I know it's very clear, the expectations are very clear that we want commitment. We want to be able to trust again. And we want all sanctions to be removed because we are not developing nuclear
Absolutely.
weapons.
I get your point. Let me take this to Professor Reginbogin. Professor Reginbogin, the Iranians want a commitment. They want to be able to trust the United States again. How can the U.S. make sure that Iran actually trusts this? And because President Trump's decision to unilaterally walk back from a multilateral agreement, which was UN sanctioned, is not something that induces a lot of trust.
Well, this multilateral agreement also has a clause in there, a provision to withdraw from it. So that is a part of that agreement. If it's considered in hindsight to be beneficial, that is really a questionable.
I agree with you. The clause is there, but here was the thing. There were other partners to the agreement, U.S. allies, who had also invested a lot in this, and President Trump never consulted any of them.
I agree. I'm not disagreeing the style. Just like here, we're talking about style. Essence is an agreement. You live with that. It's a part of the daily commitments. But if there are provisions that allow you to execute, as the United States decided, then it is part of that agreement. Now, as to the question related to the current U.S.-Iranian relations, certainly trust is an important part. I'm part of it. It's the echo chambers between 1953 and 1979. Breaking out of that syndrome is the most important part. How we do that? Humanitarian aid. Build some type of phase-in, phase by phase, so that you can verify. I know this is very difficult.
Professor Reginbogin, I agree with you, but here's the thing. As I said, the Iranian economy is hurting, the Iranian people are hurting. So what you're talking about is a phase-by-phase thing, but there is an immediacy of the circumstances for the Iranian people, and they would want some kind of relief right now in order for them to move forward with any kind of arrangement with the U.S.
I have to interject because, I don't know how impactful this development is, but when you sell 30% of the price of oil to China and get a $250 billion loan over 10 years, that's a lot on the short term. Mm-hmm. So, and if you look at the balance, at the expenditures for 2018 in Iran's budget, you'll see that there's a lot of restructuring because of these circumstances.
Okay.
So
okay.
I think Iran is really pushing ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is all the time I have for the program today. Grateful to Ms. Mohadesh Tayourikhah and Professor Herbert Reginbogin for giving us their perspectives on the US-Iran relations. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.